Wonderful.
And your time starts now.
We're both from UCI, and we chose to do the Friend from Mars problem. When we started out, we tried to figure out. Second, let me see if there we go. You can go to the next slide, Alex. We tried to figure out what we thought the biggest errors would be in communication, because I tried to figure out when I'm learning a new language, what are the first steps they tell you to do. The first thing they say is go live there and speak their language, but that's going to be kind of hard. So I I'd start with numbers, because numbers are universal, as was mentioned by earlier groups. But I wasn't sure if Martians would even use base 10. So figuring out what type of numerical language we could both use and then able to communicate between, I thought was kind of important, setting up, are they base 16? Are they base 2? What are they using to count by? And then also measuring distance and time, because we might say something's 8 seconds, but we say something's 8 seconds because of how long a year is and how long a day is. On Mars, a day and a year are very different than they are here. So figuring out a common unit of time and distance, I thought would be very important in communicating. Next slide. So what can be communicated? So for communication, we thought of using sound waves, since we're talking on the phone, to use as a number system conversion. Assuming that as 1 + 1 is always 2, if we start with given frequencies that we know, so we send 10 hertz, 1,000 hertz, 10,000 hertz, we can build a powers of 10 or in powers of whatever base they're using to then create a communication device between our numerical systems. And I also had the idea that we could use recorded phrases and recorded letters. So they can kind of punch letters to speak back to us. So saying was, so it'd be WAS. And then they're not actually understand initially what those words mean, but understanding how to use the letters to then speak our language. Then I put notes about with further, with images and in person, of more things you could do, such as elements, objects, you could point and draw. And in person, obviously, if you're able to see face to face, I think you're able to learn language a lot better. Next slide. Okay, so the grand scheme is that we use 3 bases for all measurements. We use the proton mass for mass, the Mars to sun distance for all distance measurements, and the Martian day as a base for times. And if we can convert our number systems, then we can convert our distances to their distances and then create a system where we can talk to them and be it's 3 Earth days, and they can convert to how many Martian days that is. And another idea I had is that if we start with a similar phrase every time we talk to them, over time, to them it becomes, this is a greeting, kind of like saying hello every time you meet somebody. Over time we learn, oh, hello is a common greeting. So the vegan chocolate chip cookies, I put all of the weights in hydrogen atoms, which we'd have to convert to the Martian value. And we'd also have to list out the elements included in each of our ingredients, as I included salt, because salt is pretty simple to figure out the elemental composition of. And many thanks to Chocolate Covered Katie for this recipe. And then you'll see over here that things are in 2 groups. So for the making, you have your dry and your wet, but it was figured it would be easier to give people 2 numerical values, like this is a 1 or this is a 2, and you can put all your 1s together and put all your 2s together. So then combine, and then for heating, I wasn't quite sure, but we discussed and talked about using how fast you want the molecules to vibrate, assuming the Martians can understand how fast a molecule move and have their own temperature scale. So I used Kelvin because that I was considered as the most universal temperature scale, because if the molecules aren't moving, they're at 0 Kelvin. And if they're moving super fast, they're at high values of Kelvin. And all the times here are in Martian days, as I alluded to earlier. And so getting buff. So the thought process was that the idea of getting buff is that you're able to either lift something heavier or accomplish something that you couldn't do in the past. So is that showing that if you lift this lighter element, then you lift this other element, and now you're able to lift this element before you weren't. The idea is that you're lifting more element, a heavier element each time to then get buff or be able to lift the heavier element. a special phrase. So at UCI, we have the special phrase "zot zot zot" that we say at sporting events, say to each other sometimes. So our idea was that we start off by expressing the phrase over audio to them as a zot. And then since we know 3 is, we can say 3 and zot has 2 separate sound files. And then kind of enforce that this is what we would like them to say. And then together we can do the zot zot zot.
All right, so moving on to our program. So for our program, I'll show you guys the code. So our program, we assume that we've already like set like communications with the Martian. So we're assuming that they're in the process of learning our language. So we're trying to teach them like basic sentences and sentence structures. So first we have to give them a set of like words, like define like a set of words, like is a verb, or 0 is a number, right? So we give them a known set of words because they have to start from somewhere. And from those known sets of words, we put them in, that's like their brain. So they know those words. And so after we give them like the known sets of words, we give them input sentences. So like simple sentences like I like running, or pigs are fat, something like that, right? And so with those simple sentences, the Martian our program, which is the Martian, goes through like a algorithm that we made, and it decides a category for each word. So like, oh, I think that this one is a verb, or this one is a noun, from a set of like patterns. And so for like the patterns, we could look at like, we looked at like random websites to discern various patterns that they could have, like basic English language patterns. And so after we feed it some sentences, you got to feed it as many sentences as you want. It categorizes everything. And then after that, we tested its knowledge, or like how well it learned them, by it outputting some sentences. So like we basically tested like, oh, how well does it speak English, I guess. So an example of that would be, let's just generate some random sentences, right? Copy paste them into our program. So we start. So write something to the Martian, we give them a bunch of sentences, and then we say, okay, let's see what you learned. And so he tries to like, give us some output over here. And we basically determine like, does the sentence make sense or not? So we have like one, like, no, he is not, that sentence makes sense, but other people, like smart people like Big, not so much. She is so, that kind of makes sense. And we have like some longer sentences that it outputs too, which demonstrates like, it can learn longer sentences. It's like knowledge to make longer, more complicated sentences.
Unfortunately, your time is up.
Yeah.
We can, the 4 minutes for questions begins now.